The wind moved gently through the old oak trees as the sun dipped low over the hills of Elk Hollow, Montana. It was supposed to be just another quiet evening at Rest Haven Cemetery. But something strange was happening, something none of the groundskeepers had ever seen. Scout, an aging Labrador with a graying snout and wise, heavy eyes, sat motionless in front of a freshly covered grave. His fur was matted with dust, and his paws had left faint scratch marks along the mound of earth. He hadn't left that spot in 2 days. No food, no water, just silence, except at precisely 3:13 a.m. each night. That's when the howling started. It wasn't frantic or aggressive. It wasn't the sound of grief either. It was steady, deliberate, almost mournful, but with an edge. The kind of sound that didn't come from sadness. It came from knowing. People started to notice. At first, a couple of visitors recorded the strange behavior and uploaded it to social media. Within hours, the videos exploded. The town veterinarian was called in. A few spiritualists even arrived, whispering that Scout was seeing the soul of his master. But the authorities were unmoved. One officer muttered that if the dog didn't calm down soon, they'd have to remove him. That's when Frank Delaney showed up, a retired police chief. Frank was 75 and moved like someone who'd earned the right to take his time. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp behind thick glasses. He had trained half the officers in Elk Hollow, including Daniel Whitaker, the man buried beneath Scout's unyielding vigil. Frank approached quietly. He didn't speak right away. He just stood beside Scout and lowered himself to one knee, ignoring the protests of his old joints. He looked at the grave, then at Scout. The dog gave one low whine, never breaking his gaze. Frank finally whispered, "He's not mourning." A young officer scoffed. "Sir, it's just a dog. He's grieving." Frank's reply was soft but firm. "No, he's remembering. And he's trying to make us remember too." The sun disappeared completely. Long shadows stretched across the grass as Scout curled back into position, his tail resting over his paws. His ears twitched with every distant sound, every breath of wind. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just waited. Later that night, as the clock hit 3:13 a.m. once again, Scout's head slowly lifted. The wind had stilled. The moonlight cast silver light across the grave, and Scout howled, low, long measured. It was the kind of sound that wakes something in your bones, the kind that says, you missed something, you buried the wrong thing, and you're running out of time to make it right. 7 days earlier, the call came just after dawn, piercing the silence of Frank Delaney's quiet morning routine. He was pouring his second cup of coffee when the ringtone echoed through his small log cabin, tucked away on the outskirts of Elk Hollow. The voice on the other end belonged to Officer Eric Sloan, young, polite, and nervous. "Chief Delaney, I'm sorry to tell you this. It's Daniel. He's gone." The mug slipped from Frank's fingers and shattered on the floor. "Gone," he repeated, his voice caught between disbelief and rising dread. "Cynthia found him early this morning," Sloan continued. "Collapsed in the living room. Paramedics say it was a heart attack. Sudden, massive. They didn't even try to revive." Frank didn't speak. He couldn't. He sat there, surrounded by ceramic shards and spilled coffee, staring at the wall as the words sank in. Daniel Whitaker, his protege, his pride, the young man he called son more times than he'd count, was dead, 35 years old, healthy, sharp, brave, and just gone? Later that day, Frank stood quietly at the edge of Cynthia's front porch, watching the coroner's van pull away. She stood in the doorway, red-eyed and trembling, one hand wrapped tightly around her cardigan, like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. "I told him I didn't want an autopsy," she said in a shaky voice. "He hated hospitals. He wanted to be buried quickly, quietly." He said it once. Frank studied her face, but her grief was real, undeniable. Still, something didn't sit right. The living room where Daniel had supposedly collapsed was spotless. No overturned furniture, no spilled drink, not even a misplaced rug. But it was the silence of Scout that struck Frank most. The old Labrador sat rigid in the hallway, staring toward the spot where his owner had fallen, not wagging, not blinking, just watching, guarding. At the station later that evening, Frank stopped by Daniel's desk. The computer was already powered down, files neatly stacked, but tucked inside a sealed envelope marked private, he found a flash drive. He didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he turned to Officer Sloan, who had been lingering nearby. Daniel was working on something, wasn't he? Frank asked. Sloan hesitated, glanced around the empty room, then nodded. He was nervous the last few days. Said he had evidence. Something big. Told me to stay quiet, even from Captain Moreland. Frank's stomach turned. Captain Reed Moreland, the man who once bled beside Frank on foreign soil, the man who now ran the Elk Hollow precinct, was the last person Daniel had trusted? As Frank drove home, a thought settled over him like a weight. Daniel hadn't died. Not really. Something had silenced him. And somehow, Scout still remembered what that was. Frank sat at his desk long after midnight, the only light coming from the soft glow of his laptop screen. He'd just watched a video from a flash drive Daniel had hidden. There was no mistaking what he'd seen. The footage, grainy but clear, showed Daniel in his living room. Seated, slumped slightly, eyes heavy. A shadow moved into frame. A man. The face was partially obscured, but the hands were gloved. The figure leaned in, spoke something too quiet to catch, then inserted a syringe into Daniel's arm. A precise injection. Daniel didn't even resist. Frank rewound it 3 times, hoping absurdly that he'd misread it. But the truth was undeniable. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a heart attack. This was methodical, calculated. It was murder, or something worse. He sat back in his chair, shoulders sagging under the weight of what this meant. He had trained Daniel to believe in the system, to serve it, to protect it, to never fear the truth, no matter how inconvenient. And now that very truth had almost cost Daniel his life. Frank remembered the boy Daniel used to be, eager, stubborn, always asking questions. He had joined the force not for the paycheck or the badge, but because he truly believed in making things right. He had called Frank, sir, until the day Frank said, "Stop that. You're family now." And now that family had nearly been buried, Frank's mind drifted to Cynthia. Her grief was real, yes, but her urgency to bury Daniel, to forego the autopsy, now felt like more than just pain. It felt like fear, complicity, or both. And then there was Scout. Frank had gone back to the cemetery that morning. Scout was still there, his fur wet from dew, his eyes hollow. When Frank approached, the dog didn't bark. He simply stood up, limped to the base of Daniel's headstone, and placed his paw gently on the ground, almost like a warning. This wasn't just grief. It was a message. Back at the precinct, Frank met with Dr. Lilengwyn, the forensic pathologist he'd worked with on several cases in the past. Lila, sharp and methodical, had been skeptical of Daniel's death from the beginning. "I reviewed the EMT report," she said. "No signs of cardiac failure. And the skin temperature readings don't align with standard postmortem expectations. Something's wrong." Frank handed her the flash drive. She watched the footage silently, her face growing more somber by the second. "Whoever did this," she said finally, "knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't street poison. It was pharmacological. Clean, professional, designed to mimic death and fool first responders." Frank rubbed a hand down his face. And it almost worked. Outside, the wind had picked up. The town of Elk Hollow slept, unaware that its foundations had begun to crack. Inside, Frank made a decision. He was going to find out who did this. And he wasn't asking for permission. The truth had a way of bleeding into the open, slow, painful, but inevitable. 2 days after watching the video, Frank confronted Cynthia. She met him at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. She looked smaller somehow, wrapped in a long coat despite the warm day. When Frank slid the USB drive across the table, she didn't ask what was on it. She already knew. "I didn't inject him," she said quietly, fingers trembling around her teacup. "But I didn't stop it either." Frank said nothing. He didn't need to. Cynthia stared down at the table, her voice thin and cracking. "They threatened my son, Frank. Not Daniel's. Mine. You remember Tommy, right? He's 15 now. Reed said if I didn't cooperate, they'd use him to send a message. Frank's stomach turned. She went on. It started small, telling me to keep Daniel distracted, get him to drop the case. Then they told me what was coming. Told me not to interfere. Just play the grieving wife. So you did, Frank said, his voice low. You let him die. No. Her eyes flared with tears. I didn't think it would go that far. Reed said it would just slow him down. Hospitalize him. Scare him into walking away. Frank leaned back, jaw tight. Reed Moreland has never done anything halfway. Cynthia looked broken, but Frank couldn't offer comfort. Not now. The betrayal ran too deep, not just of Daniel, but of every ideal they had once believed in. That night, Frank visited Daniel in the secure care wing of St. Gabriel's Hospital. The doctors had stabilized him, but the compound had left damage. Temporary paralysis in his legs, severe nerve trauma, and memory gaps. Still, Daniel was awake. His voice was weak but clear. I saw him, Frank. Reed. He was there. Frank nodded. I know. We have the video. Daniel closed his eyes, breathing slow. He was like a father to me, too. I used to think if something ever happened to you, he'd be the one to look after me. Frank placed a hand on Daniel's arm. He looked after you, all right, straight into a grave. Daniel chuckled, soft, bitter. Some legacy. A knock on the door interrupted them. Officer Sloan entered, pale-faced. Chief, they just caught one of Reed's guys trying to slip into the hospital posing as a janitor. Armed. Said he had orders to finish the job. Frank rose from his chair, something cold settling in his gut. They know Daniel's alive. Outside, the town still slept, unaware that a war was happening behind closed doors. Not one fought with armies, but with lies, with silence, and with choices no one should have to make. Frank looked at his reflection in the hospital window. He had served the badge with pride, trained men to follow orders. But now he was learning that sometimes, to protect what matters most, you have to break the very rules you swore to uphold. The town square was quieter than usual that afternoon. Elk Hollow had always been small, just a few thousand souls, one main street, a diner that closed at 7. But today, there was something different in the air, a kind of reverence. Flags hung low. People stood shoulder to shoulder, not out of obligation, but out of respect. In front of the courthouse, a small wooden platform had been built. At its center stood Daniel Whitaker, leaning gently on a cane, his left hand still trembling slightly from the nerve damage that hadn't fully healed. Scout sat loyally at his feet, his fur trimmed short to hide the surgical scars. One ear permanently drooped from the injury he'd sustained during the hospital ambush. Next to Daniel was Frank Delaney, dressed not in uniform, but in a plain brown coat, his silver badge tucked into his breast pocket like a memory too sacred to display. The mayor stepped forward and cleared her throat. Today, we honor not only a brave officer, but a man who refused to stay buried, literally and figuratively, and a dog who reminded us that sometimes the purest loyalty doesn't come from humans. Applause broke out, soft at first, then stronger. Daniel stepped forward slowly, adjusting the mic. I used to believe that justice was something clean, he began. Something handed out in courtrooms, sealed with a verdict and a handshake. But now I know sometimes justice limps, sometimes it howls, and sometimes it is fur and won't let go of your sleeve when the whole world is trying to put you 6 feet under. Laughter rippled through the crowd, tempered by tears. Daniel looked down at Scout, who wagged his tail once, then settled again. This dog saved my life, he said, and so did the man beside me. He turned to Frank, whose eyes shimmered with emotion. Without a word, Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered police badge, Frank's original from decades ago. I think this belongs to you. Frank shook his head. It did, but now I think it belongs to him. He kneeled and fastened the badge gently to Scout's harness. The crowd erupted in applause as someone began to cry softly in the second row. After the ceremony, they walked Frank, Daniel, and Scout down the lane toward the edge of town, where the fields rolled out wide and golden in the late afternoon sun. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. Justice had not come swiftly. It hadn't come easily, but it had come. And as they reached Daniel's modest home, Scout ran ahead to the porch, turned, and barked once, sharp, proud, and clear. Frank looked up at the sky, then at the people behind him, and finally at the man beside him. "You did good, kid." Daniel smiled. "We both did." And behind them, the town of Elk Hollow exhaled, for the first time in a long time, not in fear but in peace.